Good morning, or good evening, depending on when you're watching this. Welcome everybody to the program. I really appreciate that you're taking the program. I've been doing this for over 30 years. Started the program in Clark County, which is Springfield, an hour and a few minutes, just a beautiful drive down there. And then I started, that was 93, and I started the program in 94 in Greene County. Then came back and worked full-time in Clark County. And in 2006, I started as the State Master Gardener Volunteer Program Director, half-time. So I'm half-time in Clark County, half-time state program, and as Mark mentioned, Jen Anden is the program manager, so she handles all the day-to-day stuff, and she's does a fantastic job on that. So today we're going to talk about Woody Ornamentals, but before we get into the entire class, we are going to do a little bit on definitions. So, have you had herbaceous ornamentals yet? You've had herbaceous? Perennials?
That's the 15th.
Okay, perfect, perfect. So what is the definition of a woody ornamental?
Made out of wood.
Made out of wood? Okay.
Tougher fiber.
It's made out of wood, or it is what wood is made from. What is a woody ornamental? Tougher fiber, okay, you're on the right track.
It definitely has a perennial underground. You'd assume if it's completely cold hardy, it would also have
Okay,
wood production above ground.
okay, what is the definition of an herbaceous ornamental? How do they differ? How do they differ? A perennial, how does a perennial differ from a tree or a shrub?
Only last year.
What?
I was gonna say only last year, but that's not true.
They definitely die back to the
They
ground.
die, come back.
They die back every year and come back from the crown and root system. So woody ornamentals have in their system lignin or the bark, the hardwood or softwood rather, is made of lignin. Whereas herbaceous ornamentals are green tissue, soft green tissue. So most of our woody, in fact all of our woody ornamentals, we kind of classify, they have wood and so forth. And this includes trees, shrubs, and vines. So what is an evergreen? Stays green year round?
Yeah.
Okay, is that acceptable for definition?
It says
Yeah.
needle like, scale like.
It pretty much does stay green year round. Now it might go off color in the winter, but it pretty much does stay green year round. And then there's a broadleaf evergreen, which is what? Yeah, it has broad leaves, as opposed to other evergreens that have needle-like or scale-like, like junipers, arborvitaes, taxus, versus your boxwood, rhododendrons, azaleas, and so forth. Should we grow rhododendrons and azaleas around here?
No.
We try. We try. And then you have the definition of deciduous. What does that mean? Deciduous. What?
The leaves fall.
Loses its leaves in the fall, stores its sugars in its root system, and puts out new growth right now in the spring of the year. And then you have conifers. What does conifer mean? Cone bearing. Produces cones. A conifer is cone bearing. Are all conifers evergreen?
No.
Okay, good. You read your chapter. So then you get into herbaceous ornamentals, which have soft green tissue, but you might find some of those perennials that have woody tissue. Does anybody have perennials that have that woody tissue? Name some examples. Thyme. Yeah, thyme kind of hangs through the winter with woody tissue, woody stem. What else? Sage kind of does too. My sage actually been good all winter. What else? Butterfly bush, Caryopteris, and some of the others. These are considered perennials, but they have woody tendencies. Lavender. Lavender is another one that's really good in that category. And they can be tender or marginal. You know, we try to make sure we plant them that go in our zone, but we also sometimes have a year like we had this last year, where we had, I think, minus 40 right before Christmas. And there has been some damage to our woody ornamentals in terms of lack of winter hardiness. Annuals. What's the definition of an annual?
One to grow in season.
Say it again. One growing season, one season to go from seed to seed, all right? And then bulbs. You'll read that chapter next week and you'll learn the definition of bulbs. And bulbs are a little bit more challenging to define. We don't teach a lot on bulbs because we don't get a lot of questions, but there are spring blooming bulbs and summer blooming bulbs. Summer blooming bulbs do not tolerate cold, wet winters, so you bring them in for the winter. And then your spring blooming bulbs are the ones that are just giving us this glorious show right now, daffodils, hyacinths, tulips, and so forth. And they are stored food. Stored food, stored energy with a bud on top that will then come up in the spring. And tell me why we're supposed to leave the daffodil foliage on as long as possible.
So the food goes down to the bulb.
For photosynthesis, for the sugars to come from the leaves and the foliage down to the bulb to rebuild that reserve. Do you twist, braid, tie your daffodils up?
You're not supposed to.
Why? Why?
For the same reason.
Well, that is not nature's way.
Okay, you can say that, not nature's way. Okay. Yeah, they don't do that out in the woods. You're decreasing the surface area for photosynthesis. Now, how many of you do it? And it's okay to raise your hand, don't be shy, yeah. Do you have any problems with them blooming the next year? Yeah, so according to research and the statistics that come out after that research, you'll get better growth if you don't do it, but we know we do it and we still get blooms. So I often say as you take the Master Gardener Volunteer Program, you go through this class and then you look back and say, how did I grow anything? Because essentially you've probably not done everything the way you're supposed to do or the way the book says you should do it, and you're still successful. And that's why this class is really beneficial, because we teach the fundamentals, the basics of plant growth, so that you understand, no, you don't put sugar in the planting hole when you plant to make it, better, to help the plant. Plants don't use sugar, right? They make their own sugars. So the Master Gardener Volunteer Program is intent on giving you the fundamentals and the science-based information. And then we know we cheat, we fudge, we do all these other things that we're not supposed to do, and we're still successful. And I'll get to that a little bit, I think, when we talk about the soils chapter, or soils section here. So in the design process, and we don't do landscape design through the general training. This is a class in and of itself. It is a class that Master Gardener Volunteers would love. I mean, it's a really fun class because you're learning how to design and make things look good. So we just touch on this, and then we'll get into kind of the basics, the fundamentals of actual planting, the proper planting, and so forth. So the design process is problem solving. Problem solving in your landscape. So what kind of problems do you have in your landscape that can be solved with plants or with a landscape design?
Sunshine, sun and shade.
Sun and shade, lack of sun. How many of you are shade gardeners? Okay, what else? What other challenges?
Wet.
Clay soil, okay.
Wet areas.
Wet areas, all right. What else?
If it's close to a building, farther away.
What, the hardscape on the property, what's there as well? Anything else?
Deer.
Animals, okay. What about erosion, a hillside, something like that? All right. So we have challenges in the landscape, and we can use a good landscape design to solve that problem, to give them a solution. And it becomes the organizational framework. So how many of you have a master plan for your landscape?
But it was done professionally.
Okay, and you paid for it, right?
Yeah.
Because those folks go to school, learn how to do design, learn about plants, and they do a good job, so it does cost you, all right? How many of you have a landscape design in your head for your landscape? Yeah, kind of in your head, okay. How many of you design for perennial beds when you do a perennial garden? Some, okay, all right. So the design process is the base plan or the preparation for the design. So when we're doing the base plan, what is in the base plan? What are the steps in the base plan? What do we do? First step,
Where we're gonna put it?
where are we gonna put what?
Where you gonna put
The
what
bed.
part of the body? The bed.
Okay,
I mean, shade, sun, and then
is
height.
that where you start?
Probably, no.
Probably, what do you want?
The base plan is what's there now. What are you working with? What are you working with? So where's your house? Where's the structure? Where is, the leach bed or the septic system? Mark, are any of these markers? I don't wanna write like we did accidentally. I'll just do this.
Oh, do you want a dry erase? Is that what
Do
you
you have
want?
one handy?
Yeah.
Do you have one handy? That'd be great, sorry. Since you have this, I'll use it. Somebody accidentally wrote on our dry erase boards with a permanent marker, yes.
All you do is you take hand sanitizer.
We tried that. I just think these are old enough boards that it didn't work. I think that's what happened. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, so your base plan. Here, we have 5 acres. That one's not very workable. Let's do green. So we have 5 acres. It's a rather long piece of property, all right? So we put the house, now this is not gonna be to scale or anything like that. Put the house right here. And that's about what we had to start with. We had a patch of black locust trees here, here, and here. This is all we had. So I had a blank slate when we moved into our 5 acre cornfield. I had a blank slate to work with. So
The
that was,
driveway?
what?
That long side
Yeah, that
thing
long thing's the
driveway?
driveway.
Okay.
So that is the start of my base plan, okay? Now, my husband knew that eventually he wanted a barn and it was gonna go here. We knew we wanted to have a pond, which we had dug and it's now a 5 or a quarter acre hole. Because we found out after the fact that it's very dry, very sandy, and it won't hold water. So that's where we do our pistol training. We also put a whole bunch of seedlings back here from Soil and Water that we bought over the years for a windbreak because back here is a wide open cornfield, all right? Over here is a pasture, and I love the vision when the cows are in the pasture and the sun's setting at night, but it's just a beautiful view, okay? So I didn't do much back in here, but we also know that here's the house, here is a hayfield. We also knew that looking at this, that, you know, we're gonna have a windbreak, all right? So this was basically the base plan we were gonna work with. And then after that base plan, and I'm gonna do this all day, I'm gonna lay this down and hunt for it. We did the site study or site analysis. So, without looking at your handouts, what do you do, what do you look at in a site analysis? What are the factors that you have to consider? Now, mind you, we're into 2 steps, and we haven't talked about plants yet. All right, so what's the site analysis? What do you expect or suspect that it might be?
Check the soil,
Soil, for what?
what's made out of and then what's in it.
What else? So your soil texture, your soil structure, what else?
I would want to be able to position it where I could see it.
Okay, so your view, the vista, all right, what else? Drainage, that's, yeah, definitely soil drainage, yep, what else?
Sunlight.
Sun, how does the sun go across the property? Our volunteers are designing a Snyder Park Gardens and Arboretum, which was the former Snyder Park Golf Course. And one of the first things we did when we were doing the master plan with a landscape architect, we had her do a shade analysis. And she actually went through, and there's software that does this. Here is where your shadows are in the spring. Here's where they are in the summer. Here's where they are in the fall, and here's where they are in the winter. That helped us decide where to put those beds. Because I do annual cultivar trials every year, and I want full sun for those, and then I put some in shade. But if I want full sun, I'm gonna make sure, okay, this tree is gonna shade this area, so either that tree has to come down, or we have to move it to a different area. So that sun shade analysis, what else? You want the pH. So soil, we do all that. Soil testing, soil drainage. What else do you have to think about when you're doing a landscape design?
What's it gonna look like when it's grown?
Full grown and maturity, the wind, okay. Let me get some more coffee for everybody. No, I'm just kidding. She was on it though, wasn't she? What else? What else are we looking at? What did I say about my neighbors?
what's your?
Yeah, what's your view in Vista? I have a cornfield. I have a pasture, or I have a hayfield, I have a pasture. Do I wanna block it, screen it? Do I wanna, open it up so I can see it? The wind direction, what else? Glad I didn't make you guys work on this as one of the group activities. From the front, what does it look like? Okay, alright. What about utilities? Is that important?
Oh, yeah.
What did I say about septic systems?
Leach bed,
Yeah, so my leach bed, my septic system comes out here, and again, this is not to scale, it's right here, and the leach bed is here. Okay? So, leach bed, anything else? Alright, so I'll quit badgering you. Find the marker here. Okay, so that's a site study, site analysis. You look at everything, and we're gonna go into this more in depth. Then you do the family interview. This is where you find out, well, what do you want? What do you want? So I know I want a vegetable garden. Absolutely, okay? So we put the vegetable garden, and this again is not to scale, so we have a vegetable garden here, and it's actually in full sun. And it's not in my leach bed, though it could get close, but it's not. So I knew I wanted a vegetable garden. I knew I wanted some flower beds. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna do a border here, big flower bed. We have the windbreak back here. We knew that we eventually wanted a pool. Now, we moved in 2008. We just now got a pool last year, 2 years ago. So had I have planted trees right in this area, it would have blocked the pool and been, shady. Or, worse yet, I'd have to take trees down that I put in. So you want to make sure you check with everybody in the family. My daughter wanted raspberries, and I'm like, no, we're not doing raspberries. I'll go buy raspberries. I don't want to deal with all the insects and animals that eat them. I don't want to spray, so I'm not going to do raspberries. We wanted lots of space, and again, this is really big space back here. We wanted lots of space for the kids to play, or grandkids if they ever had grandkids, to play ball, things like that. The front yard is just pretty much open turf area. Oh, the other thing we need to add, this is our wellhead, right here. So all the things that you want, and this is where a good land, who did the professional? Did they come and ask you and go through all this? What are you looking for in this landscape?
I told her X amount of dollars and curb appeal, and I let her have free rein the rest. So it's all yellow and red.
So you are interviewing the client in order to get a feel for what they want. You can't come in and just put something in without that interview. When we did Snyder Park Gardens and Arboretum, we moved out of our old extension office in 2012, and 2014 we started planning at Snyder Park Gardens and Arboretum. We knew what we wanted, but we did a stakeholders meeting and we did a community meeting. Now the community meeting was rather interesting because they wanted a raptor center, somebody wanted a beer garden, somebody wanted a putting green. I mean, all these ideas, which was fine, because we wanted that community input. And we took everything that people wanted and said, okay, what's realistic, what can we do? And there were great ideas that we incorporated with the landscape architect into that final design. So she came up with all of this and then put the design in place, and then she presented it back to us. And we're like, we don't really like that, we like this. You kind of tweak it, and then you get that final design. So after that family interview, mind you, the only thing we've talked about plants is, where do I want a vegetable garden? Where do I want a perennial bed? Where might I want a few fruit trees, etc.? Haven't really talked about where we're going to put plants specifically. Then we do the rough layout or the elements of design. So basically when I got to this point, I started doing that rough layout. This is the rough layout. And same thing with our gardens. She came back with these designs. She said, this is going to go here, this is going to go here, here's the sidewalks, and so forth. So we knew we had a sidewalk in here to the front door. We have a really small bed right here. We have a bed that goes around here. I had a bed at the time that since has been pulled out, so we put in a little shelter for the pool. And then we finished this one and this one. So that's pretty much it. That is the rough elements of design. knowing where things are going to go. And like I said, staying away from the septic system, knowing that we wanna put a pool in the future, whether we get the money or not. We're gonna keep it open without having trees and shrubs and shade there and so forth. This is gonna be kind of our rough layout. And when I say elements of design, I'm talking about the aesthetic appeal. You know, how big the bed should be, where the bed should be. Design factors like, do you want it formal or informal? What's the style and so forth. So we're getting into all those elements of design at that time. Then we come up with a preliminary design. So she puts it on paper and she says, okay, here's where your sidewalks are gonna go. So this is kind of the big picture. This is what it looks like. And then after that, she comes up with the master plan. This step right here is where we start talking about plants. Okay? When do we usually start talking about plants?
First thing.
Go to the garden center here this spring and we see things and we buy things we like and then we take them home and we set them on the driveway and say, okay,
Where am I gonna put this?
exactly, where am I going to put this? That's what everybody tends to do. Believe me, I still do that today. Even though I have this rough layout, this big master plan, I still do that today. And I tweak it, and we've tweaked it at Snyder Park Gardens and Arboretum. You know, we still tweak, because there's things, you know, as you live there a while, you're like, oh, okay, this makes more sense. So at least though, I have the main elements of design in there and the hardscapes and what I want for the future, so that I'm not, you know, having to move things in the future. Now, that said, we move things all the time, right? We transplant, you know, but we do that with perennials. We don't tend to do that with trees and shrubs, do we? Not supposed to. That bed right behind the house that had hydrangeas that look beautiful, and I have 3 big windows that look out over it, so I love it in the winter. Well, now that's where this shelter is gonna go, because it's the only place we can put it, because you gotta stay so many feet from your septic system with concrete, blah, blah, blah. So last August, in the heat of the summer, we're digging out, you know, a 10-foot magnolia, 4-foot, you know, hydrangeas, beautiful Japanese maples that one died, one's kind of halfway coming back. We had to do that. And I knew that, and my husband's like, I'll try not, you know, so he's digging these out, and we got these big old root balls, they didn't make it. And I knew that, but that's the way, you know, you want to avoid that, basically. Now, in a perennial garden, is it a big deal?
No.
No, not as much. You just put the plants back a little bit farther in terms of getting mature. Annuals, do we do a master plan? No. If you are designing for Kings Island or Cedar Point, or like our gardens at Snyder Park, we have a feature garden, we do a design. We don't go out to the garden centers and get what's available. We do a design and then seek out those certain plants, because it's a little bit different than a homeowner might do. So landscape design is really important, particularly when it comes to the bones of the landscape. Woody ornamentals, I consider the bones, hard structures, surface areas that are, you know, not easy to move. Those are the bones of the landscape. So, I talked about a little bit about site study or analysis. You see some of the comments, or the topics, the bullet points there on your paper. We're gonna go through this, because these are the things that I guarantee you, when you do your design, or when you put your plants in, you haven't thought about. At least one of these, you'll find that you did not, or you failed to do something like that. So, site location. I think pretty much everybody does that, and now that you're Master Gardener volunteers, you know how to do a soil test. You know that you should test the soil and should test the drainage. I've even gone on calls where professional landscape designers have put in boxwoods on kind of like a 2-foot raised area. I went out to the call because they were dying, pulled one out, and it made that slurping noise because it was so wet. It happened to be that the contractor built that area up with clay soil, heavy clay soil, compacted it so it wouldn't erode. They put an irrigation system in, and the homeowner loved her irrigation system, so she kept it on quite often. Boxwoods and compacted soil and water constantly leads to phytophthora root rot. And it was a big problem. When I was with the landscape designer, she's like, I can't believe this happened here. This is a raised area. But not checking the actual drainage of that area before you plant led them into a very costly replacement. Topography, I mentioned slopes, hillsides, and so forth. Low areas in the landscape. Do you have low areas in the landscape? It's really interesting as we walk back from the house to the far back of the garden or the property. you walk through and you hit a certain area where it's just like there's a cold airstream coming through there. And it's usually like in the fall or the spring where, you know, it's normal most of the time, but you walk through this one area and it's just a little bit cooler. You can hear it, you can feel it. So the topography, the drainage we talked about, your soil is very important. How many of you have done a soil test? Okay, how many are going to do a soil test? All right, Mark's gonna get on you if you don't do a soil test, right, Mark? What is a microclimate?
What organisms are there?
What is it?
Organisms?
A microclimate.
It's like what the structures and the plants that are in the landscape, how it impacts, like you can have areas that are warmer or sunnier.
Okay.
or
It's a
shadier.
smaller climate within your area. I moved from the city to the county. I could not believe how much darker it was in the county. First night we were in the house, I got a black eye because I ran into the bedroom door. I mean, there's no lights like we used to have. It's cooler in the county, and it is windy as can be. So that microclimate right there in my property was very different from where I was. Then on my property, I mentioned that little cool spot, that's a little microclimate. Right behind the house here, I created enough of a microclimate, and this is the north side. The north side of the house is gonna be a different microclimate, right? A little cooler, a little shadier, maybe even warmer because I got calla lilies coming up every year there. I had to dig them out, but I've got them coming up every year there because it was comfortable, it was cool, it was warm enough for those to survive the winter. So you can create microclimates in your landscape, and sometimes we cheat and try to push things a little bit farther than we're supposed to be planting, like crepe myrtles and some of the other plants that should be down a little farther south, and we create a little microclimate for them to grow. The microclimate around my brick house is warmer. I mean, you stand there on a sunny day or go in the evening and feel the brick, even right now, feel the brick, and it's warmer, and that's radiating off to those plants in the front. So I can put passion flower there, which is hardier farther south along the river, but I can get passion flower to grow right up in that little corner of the house without any problems, nice and hardy because of that microclimate, that temperature difference. Existing house, looking at the existing house, looking at other existing structures. Utilities, nobody mentioned utilities. I did, I think. What is important about knowing where your utilities are?
To dig.
Digging,
Tile.
tile,
Tile coming from my house,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
I have to
your
be careful.
utilities, if you live in the city. Are they underground, above ground? And you know, everybody gets really mad at the arborist when they come in and they prune a tree and it looks like this. It's got that big old gap out of it. Well, whose fault is that?
Utilities.
It's the homeowner's fault. It's the homeowner's fault for putting the tree there in the first place. And I just don't know why. I do know why, because we just don't think about these things. Why do people plant trees right underneath utility lines? They're not thinking about it. Has anybody made that mistake? Fortunately, the arborists now are much more in tune to proper pruning. This is proper pruning. Topping is what they used to do many years ago, and topping is not good pruning. You want that directional pruning, that, you know, that pine tree that has the wire going down in the middle of it. It's essential. I forget how many kilowatts that gives off, and you don't want to have any kind of issues. Plus, you don't want to lose electricity either. This is what I'd like my backyard to look like, but of course it's not gonna look like that because I don't have mountains in the back. So I'm screening my backyard. So two things to look at are views and vistas. What is a view? By the way, the coffee's really good. What is a view versus a vista?
It is what you actually see.
View is what you see up close. My view out my back windows, I just hate to say this because I love having the pool there, but it just ruins the whole view because I could see all the way back, and I really had a nice design, so now I have to recreate some things. But a view is what you see right outside the window. A vista is what? The panoramic, yeah, look at this vista. Now, look at this picture. What do you see that enhances that vista?
The wood structure.
That bridge, that orange bridge draws the eye, and the idea here is you draw the eye and then your eye continues on behind that and look at look at that vista. So vista is what you see in the distance. Do you have a vista that you want to screen? Like the vista on my left of the house is a hayfield, and it's also where the farmer lays down all of his equipment, the campers, some old cars that he hasn't done anything with for a while. So it's a typical farmyard. I want to screen that, so I started putting in evergreens along there, plus that's where the wind comes in. But in the back where the cattle pasture is, I love that. So sitting up, hopefully sitting by my pool, drinking a margarita, I can look out and just enjoy the cattle and the sun setting, and there's a silo there. I mean, it's beautiful. It's a vista, so I would want to draw the eye, and I wouldn't want to screen that area. So think about views and vistas. What do you mean by spaces and senses?
Well, sensors are gonna be if you want to have something that smells good.
Okay.
Or go by touch. If
Okay, exactly. Gardening for the senses. What is the most common sense that we use? Common sense, no pun intended. Eyes. Yeah, because you see. That's what we use commonly. But how can we use the other senses? What can we do for touch?
Textures.
Texture, soft grasses, soft ferns. We are designing a raised bed garden at our park down here. It's an ability park. It's for development of disabilities. And we're putting in a garden for the blind. So what are we gonna plant in there?
Something they can feel and smell.
What are we gonna plant specifically?
Lamb's ear.
Lamb's ear, perfect, yeah, perfect. What else? What smells great right now?
Lilacs are getting ready to bloom.
Our lilacs are blooming, just a little touch of difference here. An hour away, what else? Hyacinths. Hyacinths in the spring, we're gonna put hyacinths in that entire bed in the spring. And then all the other stuff will come up around it, but man, the smell of that would be phenomenal. So thinking about smell, what about taste?
Mint and chives.
Some mints, a vegetable garden. Are there trees and shrubs we can put in for taste? Serviceberry, elderberry, chokecherry, chokeberry. There's a whole bunch of things that we can put in for taste. So there's a lot of different ways we can use that. And then the other is sound. What do you do for sound? What?
Fountains.
Okay, water fountains. It may not be a plant, but it could be something that brings that. Yeah, water fountains.
The grasses, you could hear.
There are ornamental grasses. Yep. Way back here, in the back, right here between my trees and the cornfield, I have a cottonwood. How many of you like cottonwood? Yeah, everybody hates cottonwood, don't they? Especially in the spring when the cottonwood's flowing. I love cottonwood because in the fall, when the wind's blowing and the leaves are clacking, it sounds like the beach. It sounds just like the beach. So we've pruned that up and limbed it up so the farmers, it won't hit the farmers' tractors and combines and all that kind of stuff. And it is absolutely beautiful. It's messy, yeah, there's branches and stuff, but it's away in the back, so I don't worry about that. But the sound is wonderful. So using your five senses, what do we mean by space? What does that mean?
Usage of it, like, are you going out to drink your coffee in your margarita, or are you, what you're gonna use it for?
Creating rooms. I'm sure you've heard, if you watch any of the garden channels, read anything, they're talking about garden rooms, right? So how can we use plants to create a garden room?
Well, you have pathways and the size of the plants and the.
Okay. How do we create a ceiling?
Big arches.
Arches, trellis, hardscape. What about trees? A tree arching over can be a garden ceiling, and then have nice little shrubs around the outside. So creating those garden rooms. How many of you have an outdoor kitchen? That's one thing I'd love to have, but that's going to be 10 more years down the road. So, creating these rooms with your plantings as well. So we can do a lot with landscape design. Existing site functions. We haven't talked about functions. So you've got the driveway, you've got maybe the compost pile, you've got the windbreak. So what are the functions of that site? And then vegetation that's already there. I was very fortunate, well, fortunate or not, it depends on how you look at it. I had a blank slate except for those black locust trees. So I had no existing vegetation. So I had to add everything. But what if you move into a house, a brand new house, and it's been there for 10, 20 years or more? What do? You look at all the existing vegetation, what trees are there. You look at it for about a year.
I was gonna say, you have to look at it because you don't know what's gonna even
Right,
be there.
right, and that's what I recommend. Look at it for a year. See what happens in the spring. See what happens in the summer. It's great when people move in and say, oh, I didn't know I had all this stuff. It's coming up in the spring. It's great. Or I don't have anything coming up in the spring. I need to add something. So stay in a house for a year or so that you can at least kind of see what plants you already have and what plants you might need to add to that landscape. Exposure, I talked a little bit about exposure, the wind and so forth. What about hardiness zone? What hardiness zone are we? 6A, all right? And then, what does hardiness zone mean?
What's gonna survive and what's not.
How do they figure hardiness zone?
It's like coldness.
It's the average low temperature for your area. Average low. It says we are in 6A. I don't know what that is, but you've got the map in your book for the hardiness zone. The problem with that is this last year, we went below that average. So that doesn't mean that it's the lowest temperature. It's the average low temperature that your area might experience. So when we get those below averages, it can cause some plant problems, but unfortunately it wasn't really that devastating this year. What about neighbors? I talked about my neighbors, you know, what I want to have. On this side, we aren't too far from, our driveway's not too far from their house. So fortunately, our neighbor put in a really nice pine screen right after we moved in there. He must not have liked us right from the start, right? But thank God he did, because right now those things are like 25 feet tall, and they're great screens. And he started losing one a couple years ago and took one out. Thought, oh, I hope we don't lose all of them, because they're a perfect screen to keep our privacy and to keep their privacy as well, because they put a nice back patio on there. You know, they've got things going on. Now, since they have kids and they have a barn and they have animals, not that I want to screen the animals, but we also have the pool right here. I'm starting to put in a nice little area of trees and shrubs along there just to help screen. You know, I don't want everybody to see us swimming and you know that story. So again, nothing about plants till we get down to here. That's the way it's supposed to be. Not the way we do it, and that's okay too, but that's the way we want to help people in terms of the landscape design. Then we start thinking about plant considerations. What are some of the things when you start thinking about, other than you just like something, or you see something at the garden center and you, oh, I gotta have that. What are things you should be thinking about when it comes to, okay, now, what plants do I wanna put in here, maybe some over here? What plants do I wanna put in?
When they're peak color.
Okay, so you're looking at color. What else?
Height.
Height, mature height. Mature height, do we do that?
And width.
Mature height and width. What else? Somebody mentioned earlier use. So there are several things we think about. What is their function? In my case, evergreen trees became a screen. I wouldn't put in something deciduous there because that's not going to really do a good screen, make a good screen. The function is to be screening. Screening wind, blocking wind, and blocking the view and the vista. So what is that plant going to do as function? The form and habit. Do you notice different forms and habits of plant growth? How do dogwood trees grow? What is their habit and their form?
They're an understory tree.
Okay, how do they grow? What's their habit? I had a volunteer ask me the other day, should I prune my dogwood so that it has a central leader? Why?
Because they come from the,
Because they have this layering horizontal habit, right? Name some plants that have a true central leader, a tree that has a true central leader.
Pines.
Pines, spruces, oaks, walnuts, these have true central leaders. So as you're pruning them, you'll understand and know how to prune. Plus, as they grow in your landscape, how do you want them to grow? Right now, the most popular tree, and it drives me nuts because when we find a really good plant for an area, we overplant it. We forget about diversity. The most popular thing right now is sweet gum silhouette. Silhouette is a really narrow sweet gum tree. Now, we put some in at the gardens because we have an area where it's perfect for them, and then we're gonna uplight them, and it'll be beautiful, you know, when we have that. But now you see them on streets, in curbs, you know, everybody's putting it in parking lots because they're required to put a tree in, but they don't have a lot of space. So people are using that silhouette sweet gum a lot right now. So thinking about the form, the function, the habit of the plant, shrubs, how does a forsythia grow? A species forsythia.
Big fountain.
Upright arching. Yeah, so if you read any of these landscape books, they're going to tell you what the form is going to be, or go to a garden and read them, see what they look like. But forsythias are 15 feet tall and grow like this. And what do we do to forsythias? We square them off, right? Boxwoods, taxus, junipers that everybody used to put in the landscape, right? They can get big and spreading, and they're beautiful when they're mature at their own height. Now, one of the things that I've noticed, and I've been in this for many years, one of the things I'm seeing in the last maybe 5-6 years, our growers are breeding plants that are a little more compact, a little more suited for a home landscape. And the great thing about that is, if you have a limelight hydrangea, how many of you have a limelight hydrangea? Came out years ago, was like the big popular one, it's beautiful. How big do they get?
Big.
15 feet tall. Limelight gets 15 feet tall with really nice big blooms on them. Now I prune mine back to the ground every year, so I have shorter plants with really large blooms, but then those large blooms make it top heavy. Now there is Limelight Prime. How big is Limelight Prime? Nice and compact, still has that big bloom on it. So they're breeding constantly to come up with plants that suit what we want in our landscape needs. You don't have to prune it. Put something in that you don't have to prune. So when you're looking at form and function and habit and shape, purchase things, use things, select things that are more suited for that particular area. Textures, we've talked a little bit about. Size and maturity, nobody thinks much about this. How big do our now banned calorie pears get, the Bradford pear? How big does that get at maturity?
40 feet.
30, 40 feet, yeah. And is it pretty?
For a while.
It's ugly as heck when it gets to maturity. It looks like an old, plain old pear. Now, fortunately, it is banned because of its invasiveness, and if we have time, I'll tell you that story. But it is not very pretty. And I used to sell them by the dozens when I worked at a garden center for 11 years. It came out early. We sold a lot of them because it was nice pyramidal habit. Beautiful color in the fall, beautiful color in the spring. Had a little problem with the broken crotch angle, or the crotch angles, they'd break. But otherwise, it was a perfect tree. I went up to Sechrist Arboretum in the early, let's say it was late 1990s, and I saw a mature Bradford pear, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that is ugly. Because they open up and they get to be more like a regular pear tree. So look at them at maturity. What do they look like? What do we want to put in there? 4-season interest. When I first got an extension in '93, the big topic, big trend was an all-season garden. 4 seasons. And so I started looking like, okay, how do we do this? And I just, great pains trying to figure out how to find plants that did great in the winter. And then it dawned on me, you know, winter interest should be where you're going to spend a lot of your time. I don't spend a lot of time in the front of the house. People see it from the curb, so I want it to look nice, but I don't spend a lot of time in the winter there. I spend it in the back of the house, out my kitchen windows, out my great room windows. That's where I want it to look good. Although now I've got that big structure in the way. It just, if you can't tell, it bothers me, but it's what I'm going to deal with. So 4-season interest, 4-season where you really see the winter part, the spring part. I did plant, we have a little nook, our bathroom's here, and we've got a little nook where the bathroom, bedroom come in, little area here. I put in a rising sun dogwood. And then rising sun is the one that has yellow foliage, pink flowers, looks beautiful all season long. Well, the best thing about that is the sun hits that in the morning. So when I'm getting ready in the morning at my sink, I'm looking out there, I'm taking a bath, looking out, it's just gorgeous. So I put something in there that looked good for a long period of time. But, you know, if I don't look at it in the winter, then I'm not going to agonize over it like I used to. How many of you look at this when it comes to your landscape? Do you?
Older you get, the more you think about that. That's for
Amen.
sure.
The older you get, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you look at these things and think, okay, how much am I going to put into it? When my kids ask me about plants to put in their landscape, I have to think really hard, because they're not gonna put the stuff in that I like. You know, my daughter is so, everything has to be really, one of my daughters, everything has to be formal. And she didn't like the grape hyacinths, cause they're scattered everywhere, they need to be in this little square, you know, they just have to be. She's very different in terms of what she likes versus what I like. So in terms of the maintenance requirements, those kids, honestly and truly, don't wanna do a lot of maintenance on their landscape. So I gotta think about, okay, what plants would be good for, you know, your landscape versus what's good for my landscape. Cause I'll put anything in just to try it, you know, mine's more of a teaching and learning landscape. And then what does this mean by insect and disease tolerance versus resistance? What does that mean?
How
Hang in
much-
there a few more minutes with me, we're gonna take a break here shortly.
I mean, tolerance is how much they can tolerate of a certain bug or.
Okay, and
disease.
still
And
grow
still
and
grow.
survive, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
alright,
And some are resistant to certain diseases.
okay.
Um,
Resistance means they don't get
Get
it,
it, yeah.
allegedly, they don't get it, right? What were you gonna say?
Well, I mean, yeah, everybody's talking about the lilacs right now, it's how much a homeowner's willing to put up with, too.
That's
It's
good
like
too,
what
yeah.
they want.
Yeah.
I'm like, you know, do they want the old American kind that you know are gonna get powdery mildew, or
mhm.
you know, or do they want the little Japanese kind
Exactly,
that reblooms but
Exactly.
has smaller flowers?
great example, or Phlox David. Phlox David came out years ago and it was resistant to powdery mildew. Alright, so that's something that it resists it, but then tolerates it. Do Japanese beetles kill plants?
Mine haven't, they just make it look bad.
Yeah.
They make it look bad, they don't
Well,
usually,
they don't kill, but they look ugly.
they look ugly, they don't kill plants, they look ugly, they make them look ugly. So do you tolerate it as a homeowner, and does the plant tolerate it? The plant still survives. So tolerance means they'll tolerate and keep on growing, resistance means they don't get it. Now, if a plant, like Phlox David, is resistant, when it first comes out, it's first on the market, take knockout roses, for instance, is it always going to be resistant?
No.
Why?
So they're hybrid.
Why?
Because the pathogens mutate.
Take amoxicillin. Amoxicillin and strep throat. Some kids take it, and then all of a sudden they get a variety or a strain. We'll take COVID. A variety or a strain that is resistant to amoxicillin. The same thing in our plant world. There are some problems that we have, like Phlox David, black spot on roses. That black spot fungus just kept, mutating, and all of a sudden, knockout rose, we're starting to get black spot. So just because they come out as resistant doesn't mean they're always resistant, depending on the specific strain of the pathogen that we're dealing with, okay? Let's see, what else? So when you're selecting your plants, you can go to a horticulturist, you can ask somebody who knows about it, an arboretum, garden center, nursery. Computer software, the web, the internet, pretty much you get what you pay for. Like a lot of people want a landscape design software, and it's pretty much you get what you pay for. So high-end CAD software, you're gonna pay a lot of money for it. A landscape designer would do that. It's also a very high learning curve. I mean, it really is, it's really up there in terms of learning how to use it. But something you get online or, you don't pay as much for, it may work for you, but it may not be high-end in terms of what it does in terms of your landscape. Same thing with like searches. You're doing searches for a plant that may have, grows 5 feet, has pink flowers, When you do searches, sometimes you're gonna get lucky and sometimes you're not going to. So, software just depends on what you're using and how good it is. Books, libraries, neighbors, others' homes. I mean, I love to use arboretums like the example of the Callery pear, the Bradford pear. I would never have really known that unless I'd gone to the arboretum, saw it labeled, saw it at maturity, and I'm like, oh, that's terrible. So looking at places where they are, the downside with neighbors and other people's homes is that most of the time if you ask them, what plant is that? What's their response? Oh, I don't know, I picked it up at the garden center and I can't find the label, I don't know where the label is and so forth. So most of the time you may not have that luck. But there's a lot of selection out there, and I'm telling you, plants are changing. Plants are changing. Once they come up with a great plant, just like limelight hydrangea, they find, okay, well it's great, but it could be smaller, it could be more compact. So they're continually breeding to come up with the newest, latest, greatest plant to put in your landscape. Same thing with annuals. My research is the cultivar trials. We're looking at annuals every year. And looking at the annuals, they're more compact, there's no deadheading necessary, there's a lot of great features that have come out recently. When you purchase plants, so you go to the garden center in October, and you go, let's say the garden center's Home Depot or Lowe's, or another box store, and they've got perennials 90% off. Do you buy them or not?
Depends.
Depends on how healthy they look.
It depends on how healthy they look. And what do you look at with perennials?
Roots.
You're gonna look at the root system. By the time, you get the plant in the fall and it looks like, it looks pretty straggly, as long as that crown and root system are healthy, then yeah, I'm gonna buy everything I can find that I like for 90% off, you betcha. Trees and shrubs. If you go to the garden center and a rose has black spot on it, do you buy it? But it's a rose that you've coveted and you've always wanted it in your collection. Do you buy it?
It's 90% off? If it's 90% off, I probably would.
If it's in the winter though, if it's October, November, 90% off, probably doesn't have any leaves.
Right.
So you're not gonna know it has a black spot.
Right.
My point here is, if a plant has a disease or an insect in the garden center, guess what?
You're gonna bring it home.
You're not bringing it home. Well, you are, but what'd you say?
I said, you're gonna have it at home.
Yes, you're gonna have the same thing at home. You're gonna have the same problem at home because that plant is susceptible to certain diseases, certain insects. So you might bring it home, but know that next year, if you don't do something like spraying for black spot, you're gonna have it again. So if it's something you really want, yeah, you're gonna buy it and you're gonna put it in your landscape, but you're gonna know that you're gonna take care of it because, like Japanese beetles, I used to sell trees all the time, and we try to spray for Japanese beetles, but if you go in, you find a linden at a garden center in the middle of summer and Japanese beetles have riddled it, you're gonna have that at home too. But if you need that linden in the landscape, just know that, you're gonna have to do something to prevent that, or to control it if that's the case. The biggest things when you buy things is if you get it home, you take it out of the pot and the roots are completely gone, that's not a good sign. Or if you can pull it out of the pot and there's no big root system, that's when it's not a good thing. You want that totally established in that pot before you plant it. You're gonna look at recent vigor, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that in a minute. Insect disease, damaged root system, and size of plant. And when you're doing trees, research has shown that smaller caliper trees do better than larger caliper trees at transplanting. Sometimes you want, and there's been really wild things spec'd in landscape designs. An 8-inch caliper apple tree. Where are you gonna find that in the first place? And then it doesn't do any better than a smaller tree to get established. What does caliper mean? What's the definition of caliper?
The trunk, the diameter.
Diameter at
Maturity.
breast height, DBH, diameter at breast height. We did a training on this several years ago, and one of my older volunteers said, "Whose breast?"
Well, there's that.
Let's say a younger person than us, right? Sorry, gentlemen. So it's diameter at breast height, so that's about 4.5 feet, and it's the diameter. And there are specific tools that will measure caliper. It's not the circumference. And when you go and measure, we've got, do you happen to have a, the stick? Did you do?
Biltmore stick?
Biltmore stick, yeah. Do you happen to have one? If you think about it and find it, bring it out. But that Biltmore stick is a specific tool, and you hold it out in front of you just about 24 inches out, and you eye both sides. It is not a 1 to 36 measuring stick. It has specific numbers on there that shows you the actual diameter, or you can use a caliper reader. So, size of plant when you first get it as well. Now, recent vigor, okay? Plants take typically up to 3 years to reestablish. Trees, shrubs, perennials, it takes about 3 years for them to really get established. They get dug up, their root systems get kind of disturbed, they get back in the ground, they start to develop root system, and then about year 3 they start to take off. So keep that in mind. When we get calls about plants specifically trees that aren't doing well. First thing we do is look at, okay, is there an insect problem? Is there a disease problem? We rule all that out. And if it's just kind of like not growing like it should, then we start to look at that recent vigor. So if you go home today, well, when you go home today, because I'm assuming you're all going home, right? When you go home today, go look at a tree in your landscape, a pine tree. Don't look at a honey locust, because honey locust is a little bit harder to tell, but look at a pine tree, a spruce tree, and maybe a maple tree or something like that. Look at the growth tip, and look where new growth is coming out. I know maple trees have all leafed out. They should be sending out that new growth. The top of that is the terminal bud, okay? That terminal bud, when it breaks in the spring, we call it bud break, it'll send up nice growth, woody growth, and then it'll send out also some lateral stems, okay? So from that bud point to when it stops growing this spring is the amount of growth that it's putting on this growing season. So if it's from here to here, that might be pretty decent for that particular plant. In some cases, when plants aren't really happy and there's nothing going on above ground, but we think, well, maybe something's going on with the root system. We start looking at this. If you're only getting short amounts of terminal growth for a plant that's supposed to be doing a foot a year, 18 inches, 6 inches, whatever the normal growth rate is, something might be going on, particularly after that 3-year establishment period. Okay. One of my first calls on this job when I came in '93. The city of Springfield had a well field, and they had planted a dozen ash trees, which doesn't mean anything today, but back then ash trees were still borer free. And I looked at them, and they'd been in the ground 10 years, and they were not growing hard. I mean, they weren't growing hardly at all. An ash tree could put on anywhere from 1 foot to 2 foot a year, so they should have been much bigger trees. They were still very small young trees like you see in the picture. So I looked at the vigor, the recent growth, and I found that the growth each year was only about 2 inches. So that told me something's going on underground, because there's no insect, there's no disease, something's going on underground because that plant's not thriving like it should. And basically when it got down to it, I was below a trowel's level before I found the root flare. We're going to talk about the root flare more in detail, but nonetheless, because of the way it was planted, they just weren't thriving. They were surviving, but they weren't thriving. So in this picture, here is this season's growth from here to here. Here is last year's growth, and then you go back a little farther is the year before. What you're looking for is that circular bud scar, that terminal bud scar, because the tip, the terminal, is going to have a circular scar. Lateral bud scars are only on one side of the branch as opposed to the terminal. So if you start at that terminal and go back down that stem and find the previous year's terminal bud scar, that's the amount of growth that a tree has put on. So find that circular bud scar and then go back and find the previous year. And on pines it's really easy to do. You can see those and you can go back and how much growth they've had each year. Okay? So a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, if it was just recently planted, it may take a little time for it to get established. So don't just assume if it only got a couple inches that it's a problem. If you planted it right, talk more about that. Number two, don't take just one branch from like the base of the tree or around the bottom of the canopy. Look at several branches. Get the pattern, because if you just take one branch, that's not going to tell me anything except that that branch struggled. Number three, if it's from the bottom of the canopy, it's not getting as much sun, so it's not going to grow as much. So look at, a little higher where you can reach out in the canopy and look for that amount of growth. It's a good tool that we use many times when we're in the office and people bring us samples. And they've got a couple branches and we look at it and we kind of say, okay, there's no insects, there's no diseases. Maybe it's something to do with the planting and the underground root system that's going on, all right? Again, we're going to talk more in detail about proper planting. So,
Would
yes.
that be already with the maple? Would it already have that foot of growth right now?
Right now, you might not see a foot. Right now, it's probably just breaking, just opening up, just sending out new growth in this area. Ours are already out. I haven't looked at their actual growth, but it wouldn't be completely. What happens, and what do you notice about this new growth from this spring compared to the old growth? What do you notice about it?
it red?
There's a lot more.
It's a different color. It's a different color. Your new growth usually is a different color, maybe a lighter green. When it starts to harden off, that's what we call harden off, it turns to the color of the stem that it's going to be. Now, it may take a couple years because if you look here, look at this growth color, and old growth color. That's how you can tell, again, that color differentiate. Not in every tree, but in many trees you'll see that. Good question. All right, in terms of planting, plants that prefer spring planting, this list you have right here, doesn't mean you can't plant them in the fall, but you gotta be a little more conscientious in terms of watering, making sure that that plant gets adequate care going into the winter. Don't ever let them go dry into the winter. You know, as gardeners, when do you put your hoses away? When do you kind of shut the house down? In the fall, what month?
October, November.
October, yeah, we get done, we're tired in October, we're done. These plants are still growing into November, even into December if we have warm weather. And if we get a really dry fall, and you don't water those going in the winter, and we don't get a lot of rain, or we don't get a lot of snow, that can cause root damage. So you wanna make sure they don't go into the winter dry. All right, so right now we are going to take that break. How long do you guys usually break?
2 hours.
So we're gonna do a planting exercise, and just those who are in the class are going to do it. And I think if I counted right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of you, right? So we're gonna divide into groups 7. You don't have names, are you in the new class?
Yes, dear.
7, okay, so we're gonna
But you can
divide.
skip me.
We're going to divide, no, you're not getting skipped. We're gonna divide into groups, and I am going to give you the exercise. You are going to teach the Master Gardener volunteers a specific topic. And I will share with you, when you get into your group, what that topic is going to be. But you're gonna teach us how to plant something. It might be a bare root plant, it might be a bulb burlap plant, and it might be ground cover or something like that, okay? So I want to count off by,
Oh, they're gonna make us count.
no, sorry. 3s, we're gonna count by 3s. Now, every time I do this class, the hardest thing for older learners to do is to remember their number.
I should write it down.
Every class, we have somebody walking around, what are you, what am I? So just remember your numbers, and what we'll do, the first 3, Brian, where's Kathy? Okay, and Nancy, you're gonna be 1, 2, and 3. You guys are each gonna get one piece of paper and take to your group, and then up there on the lectern is some markers. You'll get a couple of those because you're gonna be drawing, or step 1, step 2, however you want to demonstrate how to plant this particular plant material. Okay, so let's have group 1 then kind of go here, come over this way. Group 2 will come back here. And group 3 will come up here. Those of you who are already in the class, you need to vacate, or seasoned
So-
Master Gardeners.
I'm in group 3.
Just wait.
She hasn't given me an assignment yet.
That's why people,
Calm down.
that's why people forget their number, because they start thinking about other things. I'll give you about 15 to 20 minutes to actually, put together your text or whatever. And then you're gonna teach the class. So whatever I teach, I tell you your assignment is, you're going to actually teach the class back. Then we'll go through it and make sure, we got everything according to best practices.
So the first thing we're gonna do is remove topsoil. After we decide how
Are we
much
putting
You're
it
putting
in
it
the
in the
ground?
ground.
We're putting it in the ground.
Okay.
Not
Oh,
putting it
we're
in the
putting it in the ground.
And you're gonna contain your plant.
We're gonna go buy a plant above container.
Oh, yeah, that should be the first thing, decide what it's gonna be, its requirements, light, mature size, height, width, all that. So that should be the first.
Well, I don't know. Question.
Yes.
Are we supposed to get into the site selection thing, or we just?
You don't have to do site selection.
So we're-
Assume that
Oh, we already
everything,
did that.
assume that everything, drainage, pH, all that was done. You're just,
Okay.
you're just planting.
Planet.
Okay, so we did that anyway, so we weren't thinking.
That's good. Extra points.
Well, you want it.
Extra points.
The ball size. If this is how big it is, you're gonna go, and I'm here, then you're gonna go out that much again.
I'm going to be planting a bare root plant for us and teaching you how to do that.
So the first thing we considered was when you get the bare root, whether it's through the mail or if you purchase something or something of that type. You need to look at the health of the root, you need to look at how many hairs are, on the root itself, and how much depth there is to the root, because that's gonna, define how you're going to plant it. And then how much above ground growth there is. Is this something that has, just the root, or do you have foliage and growth on the root? Also, when you get the root, you should soak them. We didn't show the bucket soak here, but you probably should soak them in a bucket for up to 24 hours, and they needed to be planted quickly. We're thinking within 24 to 48 hours, but we also discussed the fact that you could go with a temporary plant, into like a bucket or a tub, or even into the ground if you don't have your area prepared where you might want to put it. You could put it temporarily somewhere.
So, we've soaked the bare root, it's ready to plant, we have an area made. You dig the hole as deep and out far from the plant where the roots aren't cramped. They're laying straight out. You put a mound in the hole so that the root can kind of settle in the hole that way. And then you can start to fill in the hole. You might choose to amend the soil. I would not put like tree stakes or those fertilizer stakes in. You can just amend it with some fertilizer. Peat moss, any of that, decomposed organic material, okay? And so then you're gonna start to fill in the hole. I think the biggest mistake that a lot of people made, and I was told this by an arborist, they plant the tree too deep, or the plant. So you don't wanna cover this crown. It's the junction of where the roots start and the trunk is growing. And you don't wanna mulch up around, the trunk. You're gonna end up killing the plant gradually.
Yeah. And we did put a stake
Stake.
on it,
If you
According
have
to
high
how-
winds, so that
yeah,
it doesn't.
according to how much you have, and you throw a watering can, because you wanna water it.
It's pretty good.
So,
Okay.
I think is that the end?
Questions for this group?
Do you tamp it down?
I wouldn't pack it.
Where do you pack it?
No, when you're putting the soil around this root, I would, lightly with your hands, put the soil around, make sure the roots, you're not damaging the roots or breaking off any of the little hairs and all that from your root. But you do tamp it down, but I wouldn't like step on it and stomp it and pack
Right.
it and do that
So
kind of thing.
gently.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions? Why do you soak it in water?
My understanding is that it, hasn't been in water, it needs to be, what do I wanna call it, regenerated or,
Hydrated.
woken up or
Hydrated.
whatever, hydrated, yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, any questions?
On your thing here says it would be packaged, so you cut all that away.
Yeah.
Yes,
It's usually just a plastic bag, and
Yeah.
all you have is roots.
Yeah, I didn't tell them that part, but yeah, if it's in a package or a
Yeah.
box, it could be in boxes. Yeah.
They don't usually put the organic material in with it then.
Right.
Right.
Okay, give these guys a big hand, these ladies. Outstanding. All right, we're gonna move this back and talk a little bit about this. So, you're right about regenerating. They're packed in sawdust or some kind of peat mossy material, but what are you regenerating? What is the workhorse of a plant?
Fine.
The leaf.
The no,
You're thinking xylem and phloem.
yes.
What is the workhorse of the root system?
Root hairs.
Root hairs. The root hairs. They're the ones that absorb the nutrients, absorb the water, and in shipping, obviously, they're gonna be one of the first ones to dry out as opposed to your thicker roots. You're putting it in water to soak those root hairs so they can rehydrating those. Now, How long do you soak it?
We won't
Usually only about 4 hours.
You know, you'll read anywhere from 2 to 24 to 48. I mean, it just depends on the company who's shipping it and so forth. But a couple hours, 4 hours, that's plenty to rehydrate it. If you can't get it planted right away, what do you do?
Put it in a temporary,
Like a bucket or a tub, or
Okay.
you could even put it in the ground temporarily.
You could even lay it down in the ground and cover it with mulch or cover
Yeah.
it with something that's going to
Yeah.
keep it moist. Or you could leave it in the packaging, keeping it cool, and putting a little bit of moisture on there. Just not too much. You don't want it to rot, but you know, put enough moisture on there. Last Wednesday, we ordered 200 trees to be given away on Earth Day. We had our volunteers had a plants and pints sale at Mother Stewart's, one of our local breweries, and we sell house plants. And we do quite well as a fundraiser at the local brewery, so if you have one, you might think about that. People love houseplants, and it's a new audience. It's a much younger audience than what we're normally, you know, trying to get to buy our products. So I ordered 200 trees from Michigan Nursery. Thursday they didn't come. They were supposed to come Wednesday. They didn't come. Friday morning I'm like, okay, where are these trees? So I called up there and he said they were shipped and they were signed for by somebody named Hamilton. Okay, so we're looking around the county offices, we're looking at, okay, who in Clark County is Hamilton? Nobody. So I go on UPS, I follow the tracking list, they're in Cortland, Ohio, which is up near Youngstown. They're in a box, and they were probably shipped in great shape. So I go to UPS, I call the lady, and I said, you know, we can't find them, can you tell me where they were shipped? Well, the problem was, they transposed the zip code, it was 45505, same address, but 44505. So that's why they were shipped up there, but we still haven't found them. So she says it's gonna take a day to 8 days to get this resolved. I'm like, this is live plant material, and
tomorrow.
they're not gonna sit in, yeah, and we need it tomorrow, which we never got, and they're gonna sit in this box, and somebody's gonna be responsible for, you know, $600 worth of plant material, because they're in this black, you know, dark brown box, and if they don't put them in a refrigerator or a refrigerated cooler, then they're not going to make it. So I don't know if we're gonna get them, I don't know what's gonna happen, but it, we have not seen them, no.
So you have no plants to give away?
No, we have no trees to give away. So we gave a little coupon, said come back to our website on Thursday and we'll give them away on Earth Day somewhere, but we don't know where, or we're just gonna cancel it and not have them. But keeping that root system moist and cool, because if it's warm and damp in there, they're gonna start sprouting, and I don't want that to happen. So I have no idea, I'll keep you posted on what happens if we ever see them, or if we get our money back or
Could you
whatever.
call them and tell them that you got my trees?
I don't know who they are. We don't know who, we did a Google search for the address and it comes up to this lot that has a lot of cars in it, and I have no idea what the company is, but somebody named Hamilton signed for them. Had our name on it and our phone number, so you would think they'd call us, but nobody's called, so who knows? And I'm gonna be in Mahoning County this weekend, so I could actually pick them up, but I don't know what shape they're gonna be in. Okay, so planting, packaged for bare root, you might get them in a plastic bag, you might get them in a box. We used to sell Jackson Perkins roses, you know, those green boxes. You wanna get them planted immediately, but you soak them to regenerate those root hairs so that they can start taking up water. Oops, I won't go there. Staking is gonna be important if it is like a fruit tree or a tree of some sort, because this is not likely to stay sturdy initially. Dig it hole as big. What is this little mound for?
Support.
Your little mound is kind of to help support while you're filling everything in. So the question is, do you tamp it down? And that's always a good question, because in planting in the past, they'd always say, plant it, water, put more soil in, water, put more soil in, water. I prefer to kind of wait towards the end when it's all planted. I usually kind of take my soil knife and just kind of loosely, because you're trying to work the soil into those crevices, because if not, the root hairs will dry out. And no, you don't want to, you know, stamp it down, because you just built that soil to a good structure. So watering thoroughly is going to be important. I also kind of jiggle and shake it a little bit as it's going in, just gently, just so that the soil kind of filters in all those cracks and crevices. What you want is root hair contact to the soil, so that it starts to absorb the nutrients, and of course fills with water and starts to absorb the water, okay? Another thing I didn't have anybody plant, because we didn't have a lot of people, planting in ground covers. And in ground covers, you can get them in plastic pots, or I think you can still get them in peat pots. And when planting ground cover, you plant them a foot apart, it's gonna take longer to fill in. The closer you plant them together, the faster, of course, it's going to fill in. You can plant them 3 feet apart if you want to. But when you're planting ground cover, it is recommended that you clean up this entire area. You don't wanna go in and plant just little tiny plants in a hole unless you have gone in and killed out any existing vegetation, which isn't a bad idea because that existing dead vegetation kind of helps hold the soil in place. Some people want to put the mulch down first, spread the mulch down, and then plant into it. Others mulch after. I prefer to spread the mulch first, like when planting annuals and so forth, because when you're going in and mulching around little plants, it gets to be a real pain. However, if you put the mulch down first, what do you have to make sure you do when you plant these?
That you get them in the dirt,
That you
not
get them in the
mulch.
soil, not dirt.
Sorry.
Mark, what does an agronomist call dirt? What is dirt?
Dirt? It's what you get, it's what you mix with water to get mud.
Oh, there you go. Or dirt's what's under your fingernails, or dirt's
Sorry, I'm
what's
a
under your
farmer,
bed.
it's all dirt.
There you go. Agronomists are gonna get really upset.
She
at
made
you.
me cross out dirt and write soil.
I was in an ag class with kids.
Yep. We call it soil, not dirt, yes. So, making sure that you get the root system in contact with the soil, because if you have an inch or two of bark and you plant it right in there, what's gonna happen?
It's gonna have no roots and.
It dries out,
Yeah.
because the soil's gonna hold more moisture than the mulch, and the mulch, where you have the roots there, it's gonna dry out, so you wanna make sure you spread it back and get it into the soil, and as they said, keep the mulch away from the trunk of the plant, and keep the graft at ground level or just slightly above ground level, because many of these are grafted, which means they're top put on a bottom rootstock, especially like apple trees if you want dwarf or semi-dwarf trees, okay? All right, same thing with ground covers. If you get them in peat pots have a lip above the plant, about a ½ inch, what do you do? Why?
Roll off of growth.
Why do you cut that top lip off that's above the soil?
Moisture
It wicks moisture from the soil up through that pot, and then it dries it out faster. So the best thing, if it's really loose and crumbly, is just crumble it all up and tear that off. If it's still pretty good shape, tear that off anyway, just at least fold it back, put it in the soil, it'll decompose. But if that's above ground, as wind goes across there, it wicks that soil right up that column, okay? All right, our next one, and here's what I mean, like right here, this little lip, eventually it will decay and will break down, but if it's above the soil, it will not. So the next one that we have is planting a container grown tree in the ground. So our next group, come on up and share that with us. Peggy, you come back and sit in your chair.
Oh.
Yeah, come back and sit over
I
there.
thought somebody was there.
I was.
Thank you.
Okay, they're planting a container grown tree. Doesn't matter what kind, what size, but it's grown in a container and they're planting it in the ground.
Neither one of us read our class, so we're just learning. And first of all, we started before she gave us the instructions, so we did the preliminary location, blah, blah, blah. So, we went to the store, and, I don't even know your name, Kathy.
When I go to the store, I look to see if it's something that we should be planting in our area. And also, I always read the instructions of the plant because I really don't know what I'm doing. So that's where I start of learning the instructions on what they prefer us to do there.
I'm sorry, Kathy.
No, that's okay.
And we decided that we would buy it if it was on sale, if available, so.
Or a coupon, sometimes you have a coupon.
So, we enjoy what we do. Okay. Anyhow, we took it home, and we have our location picked out, and we dug a hole 2 times bigger in depth and diameter of our plant, okay? Then we take our tree out of the container, and then, check the roots and see how balled up they are. And then we kinda had a disagreement about what to do next. She just cleans the roots off. I was told to kinda cut and loosen them so that they're out and we're able to grow. And then, we both like to put water in our hole before we put our tree in it because it needs moisture. And, I've never watered it before I put it in, so I usually put it in the hole first. And then we place our tree bulb in the hole and we ensure that the roots are flattened out or able to absorb moisture. And if we made it too deep, make it so that the tree trunk is at, or the, what's that called, the base? Base is at ground level, and then we start covering it up with soil. You see dirt's crossed out. And make sure that the tree is straight, okay? We both have a wind problem. We were kind of talking about staking it to see if we should do it, but neither one of us feel comfortable putting stakes in. Why didn't we like to do stakes?
Well, my husband doesn't like anything to mow around, so
Amen.
And I do the same thing. So I'm a zero-turn rider and I wanna be able to get around my stuff. And then we re-watered the tree, used fertilizer if we wanted. And then we mulched around it, make sure we got at least 2 inches away from the base so that we're not smothering the tree.
Okay, questions?
What do you put in with your soil when you put it back in?
I usually don't add any additional soil, but you could put in some
Compost?
compost or, it depends. Usually I don't take the time to do it. I use Miracle Grow, so,
Okay.
I have used, peat moss,
Okay, all right.
you know, to help make it, cause of I have clay, so just to make sure that it's not, it's got a little bit of breathing
Okay.
room.
Dig the hole 2 times bigger depth and diameter, twice as wide, twice as deep.
I don't do twice as deep, but I do twice as big as the hole,
Okay, all right,
because then I have to do backfill.
okay. Other questions?
Do you have to worry about air pockets when you're putting back in your dirt?
Huh? But, you know, pack it around it lightly. Don't stop it down.
Same concept. All right, give these ladies a big hand. All right, before we go on to the next one, we're gonna have the balled and burlap tree in a wire basket. That was it, right? A tree
Cage.
burlap
Okay.
wire
Yeah,
basket,
wire
yeah,
basket.
wire basket. Okay, so we're gonna have that, and then we're gonna talk about both of these, okay? All right, so next group, please, bring yours up. Now bring your marker up.
Believe me,
You can still smell it.
I can still smell it. Jamie wouldn't like that one.
Okay, this is a tree that is balled and burlapped in a wire basket.
Okay, today, we're going to discuss how to plant a ball and burlap, in this case, one that has a cage. And first of all, the first thing you're gonna wanna do is figure out how big of a hole that you want. You want first to measure the width as well as the depth of the existing root ball that is in the burlap. You wanna go roughly twice what the circumference is, but you want it at the equivalent depth. And to verify that, as you're going along, I mean, if you wanna be, really technical like my husband would do, you could take a straight edge, go across, and measure down so that they are equivalent. while you're doing that, once you go back and are actually looking at your tree, you wanna look at the root ball, see if at the nursery they had built up the soil level around the ball, make sure that the flare is in fact exposed. If they've added extra soil on top, you're gonna wanna gently pull that away as you go, but you just wanna check that just up front. So, the first thing you're gonna do is, depending on if it's a 200-pound tree, you're probably gonna want some help with all this, moving your tree into position. Personally, me planting or whatever by myself, I am gonna get, before I start cutting my cage, get as close or tipped, basically so I can just tip the plant up once I get the cage off. So you're gonna need something, usually these cages are made with fairly dense gauge wire. You're gonna want strong wire cutters, if not bolt cutters. And you're gonna just take the bottom rim at this point off. What you wanna do is keep much of the ball intact as you can, as you're planting your ball and burlap trees. So, as you remove that, you're gonna cut around, remove that bottom portion, and so obviously you're dealing with burlap, and that you're gonna have to pull out. So if you can, pull those wires up so that it doesn't snag on your burlap as you're trying to get that out. So at this point, you're gonna try to stand, again with help, stand your tree up, straight, make sure, at this point you're gonna verify that depth, make sure that you're as straight as possible. At that point, before you probably stand up, you're gonna wanna slip the bottom of your burlap, sorry. You're gonna wanna slip the bottom of your burlap, just so, again, when you start pulling that burlap up, that's already cut, it's something that you don't have to go back in the hole and do. Once you stand it up, you're gonna go ahead and finish cutting around with bolt cutters to remove that. You're gonna start removing as much burlap as you can. Now, some burlaps are more biodegradable than others. Some burlaps aren't biodegradable at all. So if you know you have a non-biodegradable burlap, you're gonna want all of it out. If you have one that is biodegradable, you're gonna wanna pull as much of it out as you can. And you're gonna want it especially be below the level of the soil. Any burlap that you leave out will cause a wicking problem later on. In most cases, you're gonna have strings or other things attached to your tree in a bone burlap situation. Make sure all those strings are cut off and removed, or they can lead to girdling and other problems later on. Again, at this point, you're gonna make sure as much of that burlap is out of the hole as you can. You're gonna start backfilling with the soil that you have taken out. As most of us know, if you have big clods, you're gonna wanna break that up as much as possible. For the most part, you're gonna wanna use your native soil if you can. At this point, if you're in an extremely high clay situation, you can add some amendments, but for the most part, you're gonna wanna use your native soils if you can. Again, just break the clods up. Do not disturb the root ball. Compared to like if you're putting a container where you wanna fluff those roots, you want the roots in that ball as intact as possible. At the end, you're gonna water it in. This might take multiple times if your soil's settling. Backfill, but don't pack the soil around it. One thing, just like any other thing, you don't want to plant, this is offside, but you don't want to plant extremely wet circumstances where you're actually setting up your plant hole, because your plant hole can be sealed. So you want to make sure that there is some give to the soil. Larger trees are probably going to need staked, especially if you're in a high wind area. You're going to want to use, if they're extremely large trees, you can use T-posts and wiring in a 3-point pattern. You take wire, usually use like garden hose or something, again, so you don't damage the bark on your tree. Usually for 1 year, if it's a good sized tree. Smaller trees, sometimes you can get by with just 2, again, opposite of the direction of your wind. Or if you're lucky and you're not in a high wind situation, then you don't need to worry about it. At this time, are there any questions?
About as thorough as you can get. Good job.
Yeah.
Good job. Give this group a big hand. And as I listen to, what is your name? Ann. As I listen to Ann working with the group, I knew she obviously had some experience. I knew what she was talking about because she did pretty much everything spot on, talking about the root plan and so forth. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I might change just a few things, just a few recommendations. Is that not where it sticks? Whew, man, this paper even smells bad. That is a pungent marker. Don't let the kids have that, right? Okay, so, a little bit of history here. I graduated from OSU with my undergrad in landscape art in 1981. I had been working at a garden center for 4 years prior to that during summer breaks. In 1981, when I went back to the garden center, we told people that you had to dig the hole twice the width and twice the depth. Okay? We told people that you could just plant it, burlap and all, put it all in the ground, mix it up with peat moss and so forth, fill it in and so forth. We had very few container-grown trees, a lot of container-grown shrubs back in the 80s. Then Dr. Alex Shigo came around with his research, and he discovered how roots grew, the real way roots grew, okay? How deep are roots, tree roots?
Not very.
Not
Most of them
very.
are within the first, 3-4 feet?
12 to 15 inches are how your tree roots grow. They grow out. We used to think, prior, and this is in the early 80s, prior to that, we would think that the tree roots matched the canopy. At that time, we said, okay, because this plant was dug and 1/3 of the roots were removed, or 2/3, we got to remove 2/3 of the top. So we would send people home with this tree and say, make sure you prune it back about 1/3 to 1/2, so that, the top and bottom equaled and they could take care of each other. Okay? Alex Shigo again came around with research, and we learned to do it properly. Back in the 80s, we didn't do anything about the burlap or anything or string, put it on, because it was jute burlap and jute twine, jute string, okay? And that would break down. And in fact, in the 80s, when we had trees come in, early 80s, trees would come in. Yeah, it was in early 80s. Trees would come in, and we'd put them in the mulch beds, big railroad ties, and mulch them in, and we'd sell them during the summer like that. And by August, that burlap had just completely degraded. So our young kids who were working for us would have to go back and re-burlap every August, because if they didn't, we couldn't sell them in the fall without them just falling apart. Or if we had to overwinter them, we had to put that burlap on there to, make sure they could overwinter, and we could re-burlap them again in the spring. Then the industry came out with synthetic burlap. Synthetic burlap that has actual but nylon strings in it and so forth, and it didn't break down as fast. And then with some of these larger trees, she talked about making sure that the root ball was preserved, you don't break it up. They started putting them in wire baskets so they could ship easily, you could carry them much easier than trying to, lift a 100-pound root ball by hand. You never want to lift it by the trunk or a container either, because that'll disrupt the root system, that will break the integrity of that root system. So they did all of these things to make things easier. First, I get into extension in 92. My first call, I go out and there's a calorie pair that had been blown over. And looking at that calorie pair, there was wire girdling the root ball, or girdling the root system. All right. The concept was for the nurseries was to make it easy. And it did make it easy. But the problem we started discovering was, since the burlap was not breaking down, if a root got in between one of those nylon strands, and as it started to grow, those nylon strands wouldn't necessarily give, and they would girdle the roots. Same thing with the wire baskets. We started seeing that happening. Well, why did we keep the wire baskets on back then at that time? Why did we keep them on?
For transportation.
Because for transportation, we did that. But what happened then, what was the concept supposed to be, that when you put them in the ground, they were supposed to do what?
Deteriorate, rust away.
Rust away.
Oh.
What does the wire need to rust? Air and water. And they weren't rusting as quickly as we thought they would or assumed that they would. So they were hanging on and they were girdling roots and causing structural damage or potential for structural damage, okay? They weren't sturdy. So then fast forward, we started saying, okay, now that we know roots grow like this, top 12 to 15 inches, they grow like this and not down. You dig the hole the depth of the root system. So containers and balled and burlap, the depth of the root system, and you don't go any deeper. Twice as wide and even wider if you can. I mean, if you can really give it a good root system, that's even better. And we said, do not prune the top, because why? What's the tree need? Leaves for photosynthesis, and as much photosynthesis as possible to send sugars down to grow new roots. So we don't trim the top except for a few things, okay? So let's go through this. So that's the history of how we got to where we are today in terms of what we need to do. So how much do you disturb the roots on these plants? What did you say?
I took a Zacto knife and
Okay, and your partner said, who's
I
your partner?
just loosen the dirt around the bottom of the roots.
Okay, what is the purpose of that? Not so much to go down. Remember this, plant roots grow in the path of least resistance. They don't seek water. They don't seek fertilizer. They hit the side of that container and they just start to, it's least resistance, okay? If you put them near your leach bed, they get in there and they're very happy. They're not seeking out your leach bed. They're not looking for this great growth. But when they hit that leach bed, what are they getting? Aeration, nutrients. It's a perfect growing environment. They don't seek sewer systems. But if there's a crack in the system and a root gets in there, they start to expand, and as their girth expands, they are going to break up tile or brick or whatever you have in there. When they are on a sidewalk, they're raising that because the girth is expanding. So they're not seeking water and nutrients and so forth. They're growing in the path of least resistance. They hit a good spot, and they're going to take off growing. So we're the ones that need to be careful as to where we plant these, all right? So we had back in, I started an extension in 93, 92, 93, about 95, 96, we planted the viburnum garden in Chadwick Arboretum. And two of our extension educators at the time, both great nursery professionals, argued back and forth on, do you do slits or do you just tear it up and let it, Both are right. The concept is that you want to expand those roots, cut those roots, so that at the end of those cuts, they start to send root growth out into the new environment. And if that new environment is 2 times as wide, they're going to have a chance to get established. But if that new environment is a tight clay pit, and they're right there, they're going to keep growing in that tight clay pit for as long as they can, unless they can find a way to continue growing out into our native soils. Now, these are grown in a soilless mix. What does that mean? What is a soilless mix?
anything but dirt.
Anything but what?
Anything but soil.
Anything but soil. What constitutes soil? What 3 elements, 3 minerals that constitute soil, make up soil?
Clay.
Clay.
Loam.
Not loam. Clay, silt,
Sand.
and sand. Sand, silt, and clay make up soil. All right? In a soilless mix, you don't have that. But soilless mixers are used, and today, for the most part, we don't see a whole lot of bare balled and burlap trees at garden centers unless you have professionals plant them, because that 200-pound root ball, getting it into that hole is not easy. So sand, silt, and clay for your native soil, she referred to native soil, parent soil. That would be a balled and burlap tree dug in parent soil and then put back in that parent soil. But when we're using this soilless mix, it's used because shipping is easy. It's lightweight. I can ship it across the country and not pay as much freight because of the weight. I can get more on the truck. It is good for growth because it's aerated beautifully. It's well drained, so it's got that perfect mix. And roots are going to grow really quickly in that soilless mix. But we take the soilless mix and we put it in a clay hole. So the concept is that you mix some backfill of soilless mix or peat moss or organic matter to build soil structure. What is soil structure? Have you heard the term aggregates?
Yes.
So you're building aggregates. No-till farming is building aggregates because you're not breaking up the structure. And aggregates have macropores, micropores, microbial glue holding everything together. Aggregates are great for plant development, and that's where no-till farming and no-till gardening come into play because you're building really good aggregates and you're not breaking down the soil structure. So the concept is putting your plants back into the hole with a little bit of organic matter mixed into the backfill so that you have a little bit better aggregate interface between the clay soil and the good soil. Now, can you plant that pot directly into clay soil and still have success? Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we've all done it. We've dug the worst hole you could possibly dig. We've shoved stuff down in there, and Mother Nature says, well, by golly, I'm going to still try to grow. And they do, right? But we're looking at best management practices, what we should do for best growth. So this is an example of a really tight root system. Slice it, do it with your fingers, however you want to do it. But the basic idea is you're trying to reroute those roots to grow outwardly. And then digging your hole, cutting it, however you want to do it, planting it at crown level, okay? Then with your balled and burlap, this comes from Bonnie Appleton University, I think it was for University of Virginia Tech, I think it was. And this is what she came up with in terms of just a description of how to do this. So, cut away your ropes, just like they said. Cut away the twine, because at the base of that tree, that twine's holding that wire basket together, that twine's keeping that burlap on there. Cut away all of that. Twice the width. Now there's also the recommendation that you might have this little pedestal here because then water might gather here. If you do your job and don't have a poorly drained soil, you really don't have to worry about that, but some people like to do that. One of the things that I would change in terms of this, and this is purely for ease. This makes it easier. So get your hole dug, get your balled and burlap tree as close to that hole as possible. Cut the wire a little bit, but not much at the top. Use the wire though to help put it in the hole, because what you don't want to do is take the wire basket off and take the burlap off before it goes in the hole. You want to maintain the integrity of that root system. So I tend to go ahead and put it down in the hole, and then that is after I have checked for this root flare, and I'll get into that here in a second. So the root flare is at or slightly above the soil surface. So I've measured. My husband would do the same thing because he uses levels and all that stuff to put pictures up. I don't. I just eyeball it. Right? They all do that. So plant it with the root flare right there. Once you get it into the ground, because the root system is in the top 12 to 15 inches, you want to cut. As she said, cut the wire basket, but instead of cutting up, you can cut and fold it down. But you want to fold it down below 12 inches if you can, so that any roots come out there aren't going to be girdling. And she is exactly right. Use bolt cutters. Wire cutters will not cut it. Bolt cutters are essential. So I put it in the hole. I'd take the bolt cutters and I'd start, and even if I didn't get down to the bottom and cut it, I would at least cut the squares so that if roots got in there, it's not going to girdle them. So wrap it down in, tuck it down in as much as possible. So again, that leaves that integrity. And then take your burlap, pull it back. You can tuck some of it down in or cut as much of it, at least 12 to 15 inches again, so that those 12 to 15 inch support roots, those roots are not compromised through that planting process. Okay? So widen and score the hole. She mentioned that sometimes you can glaze it. Does anybody know what glazing is? When you've got clay soil, you put your shovel in, and the back of that shovel just compacts and closes off everything. That's called glazing. Score it. Remove container or the wire basket. Cut circling roots if container grown. Dig the hole 2 to 3 times. Partially backfill with soil, water, and so forth. I actually don't water when I'm planting because I'm usually planting more than one thing at a time. And if you get water in there, you know what happens. You get to be a muddy mess. So what I usually do is wait until I get it all planted completely, but I've planted it right, and I just lay the hose on and soak it. And the biggest thing is to make sure you get it soaked in. I will also take my fork or my soil knife and just kind of do this too, so that those roots are getting all those loose areas filled with soil or with organic matter. Soil well to contain the water. The soil well is recommended. It's just like that little lip that you put around the plant itself. So when you do water, it doesn't go running off everywhere, especially if you have it like on a little slope or something. Try to get the water directed to that root system and keep that root system moist. So cut away all your ropes and so forth and cut your burlap back. Then on the top, contrary to what we used to recommend, prune co-dominant leaders, so you don't want 2 leaders. Look at your trees in the landscape, particularly pine trees, spruce trees. 2 leaders like this crotch angle is very weak. The strongest crotch angle you can get is this. This is 45 degree angle. That is the best angle you can get for a tree's branches. Any smaller like this, it's weak, like our calorie pears, and it will break. So you want to get good crotch angles, and if it's a tree unlike a dogwood or a redbud or some of our trees that don't really have true central leaders, you wouldn't worry about it. But for this, as long as these are equal, they're going to compete with each other and grow about the same. But if one is shorter than the other, this one's going to keep growing taller and become that central leader. So you could either prune it back to this bud right here, or take it off completely, which is what I would do in this case, so that you take care of that crotch angle. Do not prune terminal tip leader, anything like this, or the branch tips, rubbing or crossing branches. So basically at this stage, you're just setting it up for its future structure. You're trying to develop the architecture of that tree so it has a nice scaffold, nice branching structure. Broken branches, narrow crotch angles, water sprouts, suckers, anything like that. Take your tags and labels off, because I've seen tags and labels girdle branches as well and cause issues. And then, as they said, mulch, keep it 2 to 4 inches away from the crown, and about 4 inches of mulch in order to really do a nice job of keeping the weeds down, keeping the moisture in, and keeping the tree from getting what? Lawnmower damage. Because when you don't have that mulch zone around there, with those 0 turns, man, you can get in there and whoops, just hit that, and every time you hit it, you're causing damage to that trunk. Any questions? I think we covered everything here. Any questions on planting a tree properly? Yes.
On that pruning, would you show specifically for a fruit tree?
You would do it differently.
Could you point it out?
Well, if this were a fruit tree, what you want on fruit trees are better crotch angles here. So this a fruit tree is going to be a little easier than the sample. So you want it to go better crotch trees, and you want space between each scaffold, each layer, that a bird could fly through there sideways, because you want to open it up for good air growth. You would prune off the suckers. You would prune off any of the water sprouts, because water sprouts don't fruit. They have no flowering on them. They're just vegetative. But you're trying to build a scaffold of branches around that tree with a good space in between each one of those. Okay? All right. Planting and mulching depth. Let's talk about this, because this is a big hot topic right now across the country in terms of planting depth and mulching. And I'm sure you've all heard of volcano mulching, correct?
Yeah.
Why do we do it?
Makes it look good.
Looks, it does? It's horrible.
Sell more mulch that way.
I sell more mulch. I don't know why or how it started. None of us in the industry have ever really quite figured out or dug back down in to figure out how it started.
I work at a nursing home, and we went through this, and I go, God, this is what we just got done talking about, not having it do it. The whole thing. And they're professional,
Yes.
they got a professional team.
Yes.
It was probably when they started with the power mulchers. The
I think.
power hoses and all that, when they first,
You think that's where it started?
I would think so.
Yeah, I have no idea where it started.
That could be more's better.
Could be more's better. I don't know where. If anybody ever finds out exactly, it'd be kind of cool to know. But what they do is they pile the mulch up around the trunk. Why is this a bad thing to do?
Because roots are gonna grow out.
Roots are going to grow out.
Smothering it.
Smothering it, okay. Let's go through why this is a bad thing. So this is unfortunately, this is an example of how tree roots grow out. If you ever see a tree come down, it's like a pancake. Very, very, very much in the hot top 12, 15 inches. So we planted 2 trees at our old extension office, and we planted them side by side on this sidewalk. One here, and this is a 12-foot sidewalk, so the other one, identical tree, identical species, was on the other side. The other side did great. Good growth, good vigor, looked good, was much bigger. This one never really did anything at all. I mean, you could see it planted same size, same time, same company, everything was identical. So as we started digging in, and we did this for an in-service for Master Gardeners many years ago, we had a local arborist, Mark Weber, come in, and he used his air spade, and an air spade is a tool that kind of blows away all the soil without damaging the roots, and we could dig in there, like I did with the trowel and the ash trees for the city. You could dig in there, but then you might damage roots. So he used this air spade and started blowing away the soil. So Mark, can we have the lights down without giving everybody, I want it down so you can really see this. It's kind of hard to see. So we started doing the air spade, and this is what he uncovered as we got into this first tree trunk. We didn't do the other side because it was, like I said, it was doing really well.
This is the good one.
This is the bad one.
Oh, this is the bad one.
Oh, perfect, 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 perfect. All right, so this is what he uncovered. Now, mind you, the soil level of the root ball, which is exactly where we planted it, was right here. You can see the soil level of the root ball, right? That's where it came from in the nursery. You see this little bulge right here. You can't see it real well, but there's a bulge right here. And then you see all of these roots. Okay, see this root kind of has a curve down and up, all right? Then you start to look a little deeper. What else do you see in here?
Broken off.
Look at this one. You see where it was growing?
Yeah.
Okay, look at this. What's that? What is that?
Is it wire?
That's the wire basket that was on it. Okay, that's the wire basket. The root flare, the original root flare, which is where the trunk starts to flare out and goes into root structure. The root flare was clear down here.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my goodness.
So how does that happen?
Oh.
Well, when we first started finding this out and discovering this, and this was many years ago, this was probably, gosh, in the 90s we were talking about this with nurseries. The nursery said, well, we've been doing our practices the same every year for hundreds of years, so it's not our fault. And the communities would say, well, we put these trees in our urban areas and they only last 7 to 10 years. We want them to last longer. There used to be this mentality that city street trees, 7 years was good, and then you put a new one in. Well, we now know through the help of Davy Tree Service, USDA Forest Service, and another organization that I can't remember, through the iTree software, we now know that trees past 15, 17, 20 years old give back a lot of environmental services. Heat, island effects, they cool things down, they cool your house down, they sequester carbon, they sequester water, they take in water, runoff, stormwater, and so forth, cooling, I mean, all the good services that these trees do environmentally. But it doesn't happen until they're like 17 years old or up. So we can't just go with this mentality of every tree comes out after 7 years, we put new trees in and it looks pretty downtown. We want to try to plant trees in areas where they're going to survive and thrive. So the urban folks say, and the arborists say, look, these are just, they're too deep, the root flares are too deep. And they're coming from the nursery like this. And the nursery says, well, we've been doing this for years. And they have. But in the nursery, they're planted properly to begin with. They're getting water, they're getting fertilizer, they're not struggling in an urban situation. They're in good soil and they're getting good care. But you put them in an urban situation and they don't thrive. They may continue to grow like the example of the ashes the very first few years I was in extension. They grew, but they just didn't thrive in a landscape. We want them to thrive. Some species don't tolerate this at all. This tree did not thrive. And eventually, it probably is going to come down. One of the things to remember is that branches can cross and can graft together. Roots can cross and graft together. But roots crossing branches will cause girdling. So as you see right here, see how that's crossing against the main stem? That's where you get this accumulation and this swelling. What is that accumulating? What's behind that little bulge? What is a muffin top above your jeans here? Yeah, a fat. That's accumulating sugars. And they're backing up. Xylem up, phloem down. Sugars are accumulating there and can't get past that girdling area. So eventually you get to that point. So we started seeing this, and we started seeing decline. And look at this root. See how that's growing? See how this one's growing? What happens when a tree is planted too deep? It's not getting oxygen. The tree wants to survive. So the tree starts sending out these adventitious roots, above ground roots, to get oxygen up in that area. So these are those secondary root systems that comes out because of lack of oxygen. But that secondary root system grows like this. So when you are volcano mulching, you are doing this. You're encouraging those roots to grow and girdle the plant, okay? So you don't do that. That's why we don't do it, because we don't want to encourage those secondary roots to start growing. And again, going down and finding that root flare down there, had we have taken off that soil off the top, it might have been a little bit better in terms of the tree growth for that particular tree. Last year we purchased, I know I said they were overused, but we purchased 16 Silhouette sweet gums, 2.5 to 3 inch caliper, big old root balls. I mean, we had to get them off the truck with a forklift, so they're heavy. And the city said they would plant them for us, and I said to the city guys, I said, thank goodness, because 60, 70-year-old women would have been digging these holes and planting these things, and they just started laughing. But they actually came in, and we're putting them in a row. They came in with their backhoe, and they dug a trench the depth of those root balls. And that was slick. That was the way to do it, because they could dig that trench, and these guys would just drop it in. And they dropped it in with a backhoe that had straps on it to drop it in. They cut everything back. Before they dropped them in, though, they took and removed soil from the surface to get to the root flare. Then they put them in. Then they covered them back up. And we happened to be planting 3,000 bulbs for the spring. And I said, hey, can you guys let us throw, when you get to about 10 inches in depth from the top, can you let us throw bulbs in? We'll put them in there, and then you cover it back up. So they went down the road, got to 10 inches. I went down the road, threw bulbs, threw bulbs, threw bulbs, threw bulbs. The master gardeners came behind, set them upright. They came behind and covered it up for us. It was like, oh my God, this is so wonderful to have that now. So it was an easy way to do it, but they removed that soil. What happens in the nursery is as they cultivate down the rows, soil kind of gets piled up. And each time they cultivate, you get a little more soil. But when they go in and dig, they're just going to dig and put the burlap and everything because it's efficiency. Just burlap it right above. So when you get that burlap, you pull that back and you look where that root flare is. Now, so there's a close-up. See where it was girdling. So there is another method of planting, and it comes from the West Coast. A professor named Linda Chalker Scott. You've probably seen her down in NCAA, Mark. I think she's Journal of Extension or I think she's Journal of NACAA editor. But she is from the West Coast. Yeah, you can, no, leave that off. Yeah, no, leave it off. She's from the West Coast, and she maintains that people should root wash. So wash all the soil off of the plant before you plant it so that you can see this bad root structure. I have done that on my own for some smaller plants. I did not do it for 3 large bald burlap trees I did last year. But I did go down in the containers and the bald burlap and made sure I cut off any of those secondary roots until I got to the root flare. So I cut those off and I planted it at the root flare. I did have to stake, of course. But she maintains that you put it in a bucket, you let it soak, you wash all the roots, all the soil off, and then you see that root system and you start cutting things back. I think it's a good practice, but not for the homeowner. Not for the homeowner, because you have to take care. You can't leave those dry. You've got to take the whole day almost to get the root and soil out of there. You've got to spread the roots apart. You've got to find out where the good stuff and the bad stuff is. I think for homeowners, if we just at least get people to find that root flare and remove it, and you, even in a container plant, they don't necessarily plant them at the root flare, because they're doing on assembly lines, you know, soil filled, stick them in, fill it with soil, stick them in, fill it with soil. They aren't necessarily getting the root flares either, and then we're seeing the girdling roots. So with mine, I at least make sure I go in, cut off any of those secondary roots that are small and fibrous, and get down to that root flare as much as possible. That means then it comes to the staking. I may have to stake it because it may not have a good sturdy structure at this point. I may have to stake it. Stake it no more than a year. If you need to stake it after a year, remove the staking, remove the wrapping, and redo it. The only time we really wrap is when we have something where we're going to have an animal, a rodent, something eating on it. I usually don't wrap it, I just put a wire cage around it. Or when it's possible that you're going to get frost cracking on thin bark trees. You know, that's when the sun comes up in February, hits the south side of that bark, it's thin bark, sugars start running, then at night it drops down to below zero and it just causes cracking. Those cells are destroyed and it cracks, and you don't want that. This, of course, is lawnmower damage, or no, this was rodent chewing, I believe. Transplanting trees, make sure you look up the species and do it the right time of the season. You don't want to do it in August like I did. Although I have transplanted a Japanese maple in July, but I took much better care of that than I did these trees we transplanted last year. But transplant at the right time of the year. Watering is not just for the first year. If we get into a drought and you have a very newly planted tree or shrub, perennials, anything, 3 to 5 years it's going to take time to really pay attention until that plant is really established and can take in its water. If it's a shallow-rooted plant, you might have to water during a drought. Hydrangeas, for instance, very shallow-rooted, tend to show, wilting during the day. You may have to water. And when you water, you soak it thoroughly. You don't bless it. You don't go in here and just kind of lightly give it a blessing. 1 inch of water per week. Water thoroughly less often. Give it a good deep soaking. And use your finger to check the soil, or a soil probe to get down in there and see, if I leave the sprinkler on for an hour or two, what is the depth of that? Because remember, that plant that you just put in the ground out of a container is not established. It's not getting water from anywhere unless you supply it. That root system's going to dry out quickly in the beginning, and then as they get older, pay attention to those watering needs. There are some things like correlation, vertical mulching. This is for mature trees, that when the soil gets compacted around there, the arborists will come in. Mark did it with the air spade. They also do it with, like in this case, this is done at planting. And the concept there is they make those trenches, fill it back in with loose soil, very loose, well-drained soil, so those roots have an opportunity. Any roots in that area really grow and really thrive. So there's radial trenching. Then high-capacity air knife opening trenches where you have mature trees, like in a park setting where the roots are, compacted because it's, used all the time. Sometimes your arborist will do this, although there is no research that we know of or have seen that really shows that there's a lot of benefit to this. So if you're going to do this, it would be a high-dollar tree, been around for many years. Like some of our really historical trees that we have around the country, they might spend the money to do something like this. And then you backfill. And then this is fracturing the soil, which is another method that they sometimes use just to open up air spaces. Although at Snyder Park Gardens and Arboretum, we have this all over the place because the moles do a great job fracturing that soil. Mulching 2 to 3 inches, keep away from the base of the plant. You now know why. And then fertilizing is based on a soil test. I can't emphasize that enough. If we want to talk about sustainable practices, fertilizing is based on a soil test. We fertilize young trees to push the growth. We fertilize them in the greenhouse or in the nurseries because, we want them to grow and get them marketable for sale. Once they're in the landscape and established, they have the capacity to get their own nutrients and store their own nutrients. Nitrogen comes from rain and electricity, or lightning rather. If you have clay soils, chances are you have phosphorus and potassium. They don't need a lot. So fertilize according to your soil test, and that goes true with all of our plant situation. I'm not gonna go into this in detail because this could be a class in and of itself. So hopefully at some point in time, maybe you have a pruning workshop, or there's somebody who can come in and cover pruning outside, because that hands-on pruning is the best way to learn how to do your pruning. This is not good. This is not good. We did this workshop in Adams County or Brown County one year and thinned out these calorie pairs, and I'll quickly finish up with the story of the calorie pairs. So when Bradford calorie pear came out, you can see the narrow crotch angles on that tree. Remember I said this 90 degree is the best crotch angle. Down here, that's not good and strong. Here's strong, but here is not strong. So they quickly found out, this was developed by the USDA, National Arboretum. They found out very quickly that these broke easily. And if you've had one, you know windstorm just takes half of it out. So they started developing other cultivars that don't have as bad crotch angles, like Washington, for instance. Better crotch angles, didn't break as much, had a little bit different fall color. Cleveland Select, Aristocrat. So they started selling and planting all of these new cultivars. Back around 1999, I had our nurseryman, Peter Scarf, called me from Scarf's Nursery and said, hey, do you notice something weird on the pears this year, the calorie pears, the Bradfords? I said, well, yeah, the two outside my door have fruits on them. It's like, yeah, why do they have fruits on them? They've never had fruits before, right? All of a sudden they're fruiting. Well, what we since learned through Teresa Colley, who did a lot of work down in Cincinnati at UC, once we brought in the other cultivars, they started cross-pollinating each other. And then we had fruits. And by then it was too late, because Amy Stone up in Lucas County had somebody call and say, I've got all these white flowering trees in my field, what are they? She went out, identified them, they were calorie pears, and thus the problem of the invasive calorie pears was born. And if you look around any urban area where they have housing districts, that's the tree of preference for all of our contractors, because it has pretty color, all that good stuff. But now they can't plant them because they were put on the invasive species list, and nurseries cannot sell them anymore. So that was one of the plants that was a problem, and that's how it came to be a problem. And when it comes to invasive species, we don't always know that something is going to be invasive. So sometimes we have to, walk slowly, tread slowly, and other times we just wait and see what happens. All right, with that is it. It's 12 o'clock or a little after 12. Questions? Finish up questions? All right, if there are no questions, Mark, thank you for your time. All of you, you've got a great group here, and good luck with your Master Gardener volunteer training. Come down and see us. We'd love to have Master Gardeners come down and tour our gardens, so give us a call at our extension office, and we'd be glad to set up a tour for you.